In the quiet American town of Briarwood, Ohio, where cracked sidewalks ran past aging maple trees and porch lights glowed like tired eyes watching the street, a story unfolded that no one wanted to believe could happen there. This was a place where neighbors waved out of habit, not closeness, where people trusted routine more than instinct, and where the slow decay of old houses mirrored the slow unraveling of lives behind closed doors. On the surface, Briarwood was safe, predictable, and familiar. Underneath, it was a town built on assumptions. The most dangerous assumption of all was that family love could replace responsibility, and that ignoring a problem did not mean it would stay small. This story does not begin with a scream or a siren. It begins with a choice so ordinary that millions of Americans make versions of it every day.
A tired mother running out of time.
A grandmother who once raised a child of her own. A belief that blood automatically means safety. There was no villain pacing in the shadows, no warning bell loud enough to stop what came next. Only silence, denial, and a fragile mind slipping further away with each passing day. Clara Whitman had always believed she was strong. She had to be. Growing up in the Midwest taught her that strength meant endurance, and endurance meant pushing forward no matter how heavy life became. She worked long shifts at the county hospital, patched up strangers, and came home exhausted only to begin a second job as a new mother. Her days blurred into nights filled with feedings, laundry, and alarms set too early. When her son Jonah was born, he became the center of her universe, and also the quiet excuse she used to avoid everything else that scared her, including the truth about her own mother. Marlene Whitman had once been the kind of woman people depended on. She baked casseroles when someone got sick, remembered birthdays without reminders, and raised Clara on discipline mixed with affection. But time does not ask permission before it takes. Slowly Marlene began losing pieces of herself. At first it was small things. Repeated questions. Burnt meals. Stories told twice, then 3 times in the same hour. Clara noticed, but chose not to name it. Naming it would mean responsibility. Responsibility would mean change. And change felt impossible when she was already stretched thin. The town noticed too. Marlene wandering her yard at dusk.
Confusing neighbors for relatives long gone. Leaving her front door open at night.
People talked quietly, but no one intervened. In towns like Briarwood, privacy was sacred even when it became dangerous. Clara told herself what everyone else did. That it was just old age. That it was manageable. That tomorrow she would deal with it. Tomorrow kept getting postponed. When Clara was invited to an evening work event, one that she knew could help her career, she felt trapped between guilt and relief. She needed a few hours to feel normal again. To dress like a professional instead of a caretaker. To remember who she was before exhaustion defined her. Hiring help felt expensive and humiliating. Canceling felt like failure. Leaving Jonah with Marlene felt familiar and therefore safe. That belief settled in her mind like a lie that repeated itself often enough to feel true. She told herself it would only be for a little while. She prepared bottles, wrote instructions, packed a bag, and ignored the quiet voice telling her something was wrong. When she placed Jonah into her mother's arms, she saw a flicker of confusion in Marlene's eyes, then a smile that looked almost right. Almost was enough. Clara kissed her son and left before doubt could catch up with her. What happened next was not sudden. It was the final collapse of a structure weakened over years by neglect, misunderstanding, and fear of facing decline. A mind that no longer understood time or consequence was given responsibility it could not handle. Love without awareness became a weapon. Trust without preparation became a tragedy. This is not a story about cruelty. It is a story about avoidance. About how busy lives and good intentions can still lead to irreversible damage. About how the most dangerous moments often arrive quietly wrapped in familiarity.
And about how one ordinary decision made in a moment of exhaustion can echo through generations, leaving nothing untouched.
What unfolded in that small Ohio house would shatter a family, redefine a town, and leave behind a question that lingers long after the last tear is shed. Not how could this happen, but why it was allowed to. The afternoon settled over Briarwood, Ohio with the slow weight of early autumn, the kind of day that felt suspended between warmth and cold, between comfort and warning. Sunlight filtered through thinning leaves and stretched across quiet residential streets where nothing ever seemed urgent enough to demand attention. Clara Whitman drove with one hand on the steering wheel and the other resting lightly near the back seat, as if she could feel her son Jonah simply by proximity. He slept peacefully in his car seat, his small chest rising and falling in steady rhythm, unaware that this ordinary drive carried him toward the most consequential hours of his short life. Clara had just come off a long hospital shift, the kind that drained not only the body but the spirit. Flu season had begun early, tempers were short, and staff were stretched thin. She had spent the morning moving from room to room solving problems for other families while quietly ignoring the fracture lines in her own. By the time she clocked out, her head throbbed and her thoughts blurred together. All she wanted was a few hours where she did not have to be responsible for anyone. Not patients. Not her mother. Not even herself. She told herself that wanting this did not make her a bad mother. It made her human. The road to Marlene Whitman's house was familiar. Clara had driven it hundreds of times over the years, back when visits were filled with shared meals and easy conversation. Lately those visits had grown tense and brief. She stayed long enough to convince herself everything was fine and left before discomfort turned into confrontation. As she pulled into the driveway, she noticed the familiar details she had trained herself to overlook.
The uneven lawn. The peeling paint.
The mailbox stuffed with unopened envelopes. Each detail registered and then was immediately explained away. She did not have the energy to unpack them. Inside the house the air smelled faintly of dust and something old. Not rotten. Just neglected. Marlene emerged from the hallway slowly, wearing a cardigan despite the warmth, her hair pinned back in a way that suggested effort without success. She smiled when she saw Clara, but her eyes hesitated just a fraction too long before recognition settled in. Clara noticed and ignored it. They spoke in small sentences. Weather. Work. How big Jonah was getting. Marlene reached out to touch the baby's cheek with reverence that looked genuine but lacked grounding. She asked questions Clara had already answered. Clara repeated herself with practiced patience. She laid out the bottles. The schedule. The instructions written carefully on a piece of paper she knew might never be read. As she spoke, she felt the tug of doubt. A pressure behind her ribs. A sense that she was rushing past something important. But doubt requires space to breathe, and Clara had none. The clock ticked louder than her instincts. Her phone buzzed with messages reminding her where she was supposed to be and when. When she placed Jonah into Marlene's arms, there was a moment. A brief pause in which everything seemed to hold still. The baby stirred and Marlene adjusted her grip clumsily before settling him against her chest. Clara considered taking him back, saying she had changed her mind, canceling her plans. That moment passed. She kissed Jonah's forehead. She told her mother she would be back soon. She told herself she was doing the best she could. Driving away, she felt relief rush in so fast it almost hurt.
Relief at silence.
Relief at being alone. Relief at reclaiming a version of herself that did not exist in fragments. She promised herself she would check in later. She promised herself she would make real plans soon. She promised herself many things. Inside Marlene's house, time loosened its grip. Left alone with the baby, Marlene drifted between moments without noticing the transitions. She sat. She stood. She hummed. Jonah cried and was soothed and cried again. Sounds overlapped with memories.
The present tangled with the past.
In her mind, she was not an elderly woman caring for a grandchild, but a younger version of herself following routines that once made sense. The house around her shifted subtly in her perception. Rooms felt familiar in the wrong way. Objects took on meanings they no longer held. She moved from room to room, guided not by intention but by habit. Habit stripped of context becomes dangerous. The baby's needs no longer registered clearly as needs. They blurred into signals that her mind misinterpreted. Hunger sounded like urgency.
Crying sounded like instruction.
Confusion filled in the gaps where judgment should have been. Outside, the neighborhood continued as usual. Cars passed. Lights turned on. Families gathered around tables and televisions. No one noticed the quiet house on the corner, where awareness was unraveling minute by minute. Back across town, Clara laughed at something someone said. She checked her phone and saw no missed calls. She relaxed a little more. Each passing minute made the decision feel more justified, more final. Inside Marlene's mind, the last threads of clarity slipped away.
The world narrowed. The rules of reality dissolved.
What remained was action without understanding and care without comprehension. And so the distance between intention and consequence closed silently. Not with chaos. Not with warning. just with the soft inevitability of a door closing behind them all. As the afternoon slid quietly toward evening, the house seemed to exhale, settling into the kind of stillness that comes when the world outside moves on without you. The light inside Marlene Whitman's living room shifted slowly, stretching shadows across the floor and climbing the walls in unfamiliar shapes. The ticking clock on the wall continued its steady rhythm, though time itself had lost meaning inside her mind. Minutes no longer connected logically to what came before or after. Everything existed in fragments, stitched together by memories that no longer belonged to the present. Marlene sat with Jonah cradled against her, rocking gently as she had done countless times before in another life. The motion was muscle memory, not intention. Her arms remembered even when her mind could not. She hummed softly, a tune without a clear beginning or end, something that echoed from decades earlier when her own child had been small. The baby shifted and made sounds that should have signaled need, but those signals no longer translated clearly. They were simply noise layered onto the constant hum of confusion that had become her reality. In Marlene's mind, the house was no longer the same house. Rooms rearranged themselves. The present slipped backward without warning. She was not an elderly woman watching her grandson. She was a younger version of herself caught in a memory loop where tasks demanded completion and routines governed survival. Her thoughts jumped without logic, guided by instinct stripped of context. What should have been care became misinterpretation. What should have been protection dissolved into something unrecognizable. She stood and moved through the house slowly, each step deliberate but disconnected from consequence. The kitchen drew her in, not because she was hungry, but because it was where she believed she was needed. Familiar objects triggered old roles. Countertops became workspaces. Ordinary items took on imagined purpose. Her hands acted before her awareness could intervene.
Jonah cried again.
The sound pierced briefly through the fog, sharp enough to stir irritation but not understanding. Marlene felt overwhelmed by urgency without knowing why. Her mind reached for explanations that no longer applied. She spoke to herself in half sentences, trying to organize a world that refused to stay still. The baby's presence no longer registered as fragile life but as part of a task she believed she needed to finish. Outside the house, the neighborhood moved through its routines. Dinner tables were set.
Televisions flickered on.
Porch lights glowed. No one heard what was happening inside. No alarm was triggered. No voice rose loudly enough to travel beyond the walls. Tragedy did not announce itself. It unfolded quietly in isolation, protected by familiarity and neglect. As daylight faded, Marlene's awareness narrowed further. She became focused on immediate sensations and impulses, disconnected from empathy or foresight. Her illness stripped away the ability to recognize danger, replacing it with distorted logic that felt internally consistent. In that state there was no malice, no intent to harm. There was only action driven by a broken understanding of reality. When the moment passed, Marlene did not react as someone with clarity would have. There was no realization, no horror,
no panic.
Only a vague sense that something had been completed.
The house fell into a deeper silence, heavier than before.
She moved away from the kitchen without looking back, guided by exhaustion rather than awareness. She returned to the living room and sat in her chair as if nothing had happened. The television turned on automatically at the same hour it always did, filling the room with canned laughter and familiar faces. The contrast between sound and reality was stark, but Marlene did not notice. She watched without understanding, her body sinking into the cushions, her mind already drifting elsewhere. Hours passed unnoticed. Darkness wrapped the house completely. The phone on the wall remained untouched.
No call came from Clara. No message interrupted the stillness.
The distance between mother and daughter stretched invisibly across town, sealed by assumption and silence. In Marlene's thoughts, images floated in and out. Her husband younger and smiling.
Clara as a child running through the yard.
A sense of completion mixed with unease she could not name. The mind protects itself when it can no longer process truth. Dementia built a wall between her and the consequences of her actions, sparing her awareness while devastating everything else. By the time the first hint of concern stirred beyond the walls, the damage was already complete. What had happened could not be undone. What had been lost could not be returned. The chain of small decisions and unspoken warnings had led to this single irreversible point. Inside the quiet house, an old woman sat alone, unaware that the world she had fractured was already beginning to collapse beyond her understanding. The first sign that something was wrong did not come from inside the house, but from the absence of sound. In a neighborhood where routines were as predictable as the sunrise silence carried weight, lights usually flicked on at dusk.
Televisions murmured through thin walls.
Babies cried. Dogs barked. On this evening one house remained unnaturally still. Across the street a neighbor paused while taking out the trash and frowned at the darkened windows of Marlene Whitman's home. The porch light was on, but nothing moved behind the glass. Earlier that afternoon she had seen Clara's car pull away and assumed everything was normal. Now hours had passed. Too many hours. A faint unease crept in and refused to leave. The knock at the door went unanswered. Inside, Marlene sat in her living room chair staring at the television, her body slack with fatigue, her mind wandering freely through memories that no longer connected to reality. When the knocking grew louder she reacted slowly, irritation rising before recognition. By the time she reached the door the world outside felt intrusive and confusing.
The arrival of the police broke the fragile isolation.
Their presence was calm, professional, and routine at first. Questions were asked. Answers came back tangled and nonsensical. Marlene spoke kindly but vaguely, referencing people who were not there and tasks that made no sense. One officer stepped into the kitchen and stopped short. What followed unfolded with grim efficiency. The house was secured. Backup was called. Marlene was guided gently to a seat and wrapped in a blanket she did not understand she needed. She asked when Clara would be home. She asked if supper was ready. She smiled. Across town Clara was laughing at something she would never remember. Her phone buzzed in her purse unnoticed. By the time she saw the missed calls it was too late to change anything. When she returned to her mother's street, flashing lights painted the houses in colors that did not belong there. The tape stretched across the yard looked unreal, like a prop from a nightmare.
Clara's scream cut through the night when she understood.
The following hours blurred together in fragments. Statements given through sobs. Questions repeated. The weight of truth settling in piece by piece. Harlan arrived and wrapped his arms around her, but even then the world felt detached, as if she were watching someone else's life fall apart. Marlene was taken into custody not as a criminal but as a patient. Doctors examined her. Specialists asked questions designed to measure understanding that no longer existed. She failed every test that mattered. She did not comprehend what had happened. She did not grasp why people around her cried. Her mind had sealed itself away from the consequences. The legal process moved forward carefully, cautiously, constrained by the boundaries of mental health law. Psychiatrists testified. Neurologists reviewed records that told a story of decline that had been unfolding for years. Missed appointments. Untreated symptoms. Warnings documented and unheeded. The conclusion was inevitable. Marlene was declared not competent to stand trial. She was committed to a long-term care facility where supervision would replace freedom. There would be no prison, no sentence, no acknowledgement of guilt from the person who had caused the harm. The community reacted with confusion and anger. Some demanded punishment. Others spoke about illness and compassion. Town meetings filled with raised voices and unanswered questions. How much responsibility belonged to family? How much belonged to the system? How much could be blamed on illness alone? For Clara the decision felt like another loss layered on top of the first. There was no closure. No justice that felt complete. Her mother was alive yet unreachable. Her son was gone without meaning. The structure of her life collapsed inward. Harlan changed during those weeks. Grief hardened him. Silence replaced his patience. He replayed the decision over and over, searching for a different ending that never appeared. The law had spoken, but it had not satisfied him. Mercy felt like betrayal. Compassion felt like theft. As Marlene was moved quietly into institutional care, the town began to move on. News trucks left. Conversations shifted. Life continued for everyone except the family at the center of it all.
Inside the Whitman home, rooms sat untouched.
Jonah's things remained where they had been placed, as if time itself had stopped. Clara wandered through the house at night, touching objects without purpose, her mind circling the same question endlessly. Why had she ignored what she knew? Part 4 ended not with resolution, but with a widening fracture. A decision meant to protect had failed. A system meant to balance justice and mercy had chosen one over the other. And in the space between law and loss, something dangerous began to take root. Something that would soon turn grief into action. Grief does not arrive all at once. It settles slowly, changing shape as it sinks deeper, until it becomes something else entirely. For Harlan Brooks, grief hardened into anger so gradually that he barely noticed the transformation. In the weeks after the court ruled that Marlene Whitman would never face criminal trial, something inside him shut down. The world had decided that what happened to his son belonged to illness rather than accountability. The law had spoken in careful language about mental incapacity and compassion. To Harlan, it sounded like surrender. He had always believed in systems.
Numbers made sense. Rules made sense.
Consequences followed actions. That belief had shaped his entire life. He worked quietly, paid his taxes, followed the rules, trusted that doing so meant protection. Watching the woman responsible for his child's death be placed into care instead of confinement shattered that belief. The world no longer felt ordered. It felt arbitrary and cruel. At home, Clara drifted through days like a ghost. She barely spoke. Harlan tried to reach her at first, holding her hand in silence, offering comfort without knowing what words could possibly help. But as the weeks passed and nothing changed, his empathy began to thin. He did not blame Clara, not consciously, but resentment seeped in anyway. If she had not left Jonah there. If she had listened to him. If she had acted sooner. These thoughts arrived uninvited and stayed. Harlan began sleeping poorly. When he did sleep, he dreamed of loops without endings. He replayed the day of the drop-off. The courtroom decision. The image of Marlene smiling without comprehension. Each memory sharpened his sense of injustice. Friends urged patience. Therapists spoke about processing grief. None of it touched the raw certainty forming inside him. Someone had to pay. If the law would not do it, then the law had failed. He researched quietly at first. Reading about dementia. About criminal responsibility. About cases where illness erased guilt. The more he learned, the more betrayed he felt. Knowledge did not soothe him. It armed him. He began to believe that mercy had crossed a line into negligence. That protecting Marlene had come at the cost of everyone else. The idea did not arrive as a plan. It arrived as a feeling. A tightening in his chest whenever he imagined her living safely while Jonah lay in the ground. He drove past the care facility once without stopping. Then again. He memorized the turns. The entrance. The rhythm of the place. He told himself he only wanted to look. To understand. To feel something other than helplessness. When he finally decided to act, it felt less like choice and more like inevitability. The decision settled over him with calm clarity. In his mind, this was not revenge. It was correction. A balance restored. He convinced himself that removing Marlene from the world was an act of responsibility. That it would close the wound left open by the system. The day he went there, the weather was clear and cold. He dressed carefully. He moved deliberately. Every step felt heavy but controlled. When he stood in front of her, she did not recognize him. She asked about people long dead. She smiled with harmless confusion. That moment should have stopped him. Instead, it enraged him. Her innocence felt like mockery. Her lack of awareness felt like escape. What happened next ended two lives at once. The aftermath unfolded quickly and publicly. Security intervened. Police arrived. Harlan did not resist. He did not run. His expression was empty, as if the act had drained him of whatever had been left. When questioned, he spoke calmly. He said he had done what the system would not. He said someone had to take responsibility. The trial was swift. Evidence was overwhelming. Intent was clear. There was no illness to shield him. No ambiguity. The same courtroom that had offered mercy now delivered judgment without hesitation. Harlan was sentenced to spend the rest of his life behind bars.
Clara sat through the proceedings in silence.
By then she had lost the capacity to react. One life taken by illness. One by rage. Her family erased in stages. When the sentence was read, she did not cry.
Something deeper had broken.
The town reacted with shock layered over exhaustion. Sympathy gave way to distance. The story had grown too heavy. Too uncomfortable. People stopped asking how Clara was doing. They did not know what to say. Harlan entered prison carrying the certainty that his act had meaning. It did not take long for that certainty to erode. In the stillness of his cell, the noise returned. Doubt crept in where righteousness once lived. He had not brought Jonah back. He had not healed Clara. He had only added another grave to the story. Revenge did not restore order. It completed the collapse. By the time Harlan understood that truth, it was too late to do anything with it. When everything was over and there was nothing left to wait for, the world did what it always does. It continued. Seasons shifted. News cycles moved on. New tragedies replaced old ones. In Briarwood, Ohio, the streets looked the same as they always had, but for Clara Whitman, time no longer moved forward in any meaningful way. It simply repeated itself inside her mind, looping through regret and memory without rest. The house became unbearable. Every room held echoes. The nursery remained untouched, frozen in a moment that would never return. Dust settled on the crib rail where her hand had once rested. Tiny clothes stayed folded in drawers she could not bring herself to open. At night she lay awake listening for sounds that no longer existed. A baby crying. A husband breathing beside her. The absence of those sounds pressed against her chest until breathing felt like work. Clara tried to return to routine because routine had always been her refuge. She went back to the hospital. She put on her uniform. She followed procedures. But something fundamental had changed. Where she once compartmentalized pain, she now carried it openly. Patients spoke to her and she struggled to hear them. Simple decisions overwhelmed her. Colleagues noticed the delay in her responses, the way her gaze drifted away mid-conversation. Eventually concern turned into intervention. Meetings were called. Words like burnout and trauma were used carefully. Clara nodded and agreed and promised to take care of herself. She did not know how to explain that she no longer trusted herself to care for anyone, including herself. The guilt was relentless. It did not shout. It whispered constantly. It replayed small moments and magnified them into proof of failure. The decision to leave Jonah. The choice to ignore warning signs. The way she dismissed her husband's concerns. In therapy sessions, she spoke softly as if afraid to disturb the weight pressing down on her. She said she understood now. She said it was her fault. No amount of reassurance could reach her because the verdict had already been delivered in her own mind. As months passed, isolation replaced grief. Friends stopped calling after too many unanswered messages. Neighbors offered help once, then withdrew when she declined. Support requires participation, and Clara no longer had the energy to perform recovery for anyone. She drifted through days, eating when reminded, sleeping when exhaustion overtook her. The first break came quietly. She began hearing sounds that were not there. At first she dismissed them as imagination. Then they became persistent.
A baby crying from another room.
Footsteps in an empty hallway. Her mother's voice calling her name with urgency. She began leaving the house at odd hours following these sounds without knowing where she was going. One evening, police found her standing outside the old house on Maple Street staring at the boarded windows. She did not resist when they approached. She seemed relieved. In the emergency department where she once worked, she now sat as a patient answering questions she barely understood. Doctors spoke about cumulative trauma, about unresolved grief, about genetic vulnerability. The language was clinical, but the meaning was simple. Clara was breaking. Admission to long-term care followed. Medication dulled the sharpest edges of her thoughts but could not erase the past. In group therapy, she listened to others speak about loss and recovery, but her own story felt too heavy to share. When she did speak, her words were fragmented, circling the same regret again and again. Harlan wrote from prison. His letters were long and reflective, filled with apologies and attempts at meaning. Clara read some of them. Others she set aside unopened. Seeing his handwriting reminded her that rage had not saved anyone. That vengeance had only deepened the ruin. She did not hate him. She did not forgive him. She simply no longer had the strength for either. Years passed in small increments measured by medication schedules and therapy sessions. The town forgot the details of the case. The house on Maple Street was sold, renovated, and filled with new life. Children played in the yard where tragedy once took root, unaware of the history beneath their feet. Clara aged quietly within the institution. Some days she was lucid enough to understand the full shape of what had happened. Other days she drifted, lost in memory, the same way her mother once had. The resemblance frightened the staff. It frightened Clara too when she noticed it. In her clearest moments she understood the lesson that had come at an unbearable cost. That love without responsibility is dangerous. That ignoring decline does not stop it. That waiting too long can turn ordinary decisions into irreversible ones. And that revenge does not heal grief. It multiplies it. The story of the Whitman family did not end with justice or redemption. It ended with silence. With lives diminished rather than restored. With a warning written not in law but in loss. In Briarwood, Ohio, life went on. But for those who knew the truth, the memory lingered as a quiet reminder. Care must come before convenience. Attention before assumption. And when the signs appear, they must be faced while there is still time to change the ending.